Michael, a successful businessman, has long dreamed of a vacation. He chose a cruise trip to the Caribbean to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city and enjoy the serenity of the ocean. Climbing aboard the liner Atlantis, he was mesmerized by the luxury of the ship and anticipated a week full of new experiences. On the first evening, Michael went to the open deck to sip a glass of wine under the stars and enjoy the view of the sunset. At the bar he noticed an older man sitting alone, looking off into the distance with a pensive expression on his face. The man was dressed in a simple navy jacket and looked like a man who knew the ocean better than anyone. Michael sat down next to him, and after a few minutes they struck up a conversation. "The view from here is amazing, isn't it?" Michael began. The old man, who introduced himself as Henry, nodded, but his gaze remained anxious. "Yes, it's beautiful," he said in a husky voice, "but these waters hide something darker than just the waves." Michael, accustomed to tales of the sea, grinned. "What are you talking about, Henry?" The old man leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Many years ago I was a sailor. My crew and I were sailing along these same routes when we saw something that changed us forever. It was a ghost ship. They say that when it's seen, one of the crew members is bound to die." Michael was wary, but only shrugged. "What happened?" "I lost my best friend that night," Henry answered, his eyes glistening with memories. "He died under strange circumstances, and the ship, it disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared." Michael shook his head with a smile, not believing such stories. Wishing Henry a good night, he went to his cabin. The night was quiet, but Michael couldn't sleep. The uneasiness caused by the old man's words did not leave him. After a couple of hours, Michael decided to go out on deck to get some fresh sea air and smoke a cigarette. The ocean was an endless dark surface, with only the moonlight touching its surface. He was standing there, immersed in his thoughts, when his gaze caught on something strange. In the distance, in the night haze, he saw the outline of a ship. At first he thought it was another ship traveling the same route, but after a couple of seconds the ship disappeared, as if it had never been there. Michael froze. "Am I imagining things?" he thought, nervously waving the vision away and writing it off as fatigue. He put out his cigarette and went back to his cabin, convincing himself that the dream was just a joke. The next morning, panic reigned on the liner. Passengers and crew were alarmed when it was discovered that a crew member had been found dead. The circumstances of his death remained mysterious and horrifying. No one could explain what had happened. Michael felt a cold dread. Henry's words flashed through his mind. "When you see a ghost ship, one of the crew is dead." He rushed all over the liner in search of the elderly man, but he was gone. Neither passengers nor staff could remember seeing Henry after that conversation. A sense of unreality swept over Michael. He stood at the side of the ship, looking out at the vast ocean, and realized that he had encountered an ancient secret that the ocean preferred to hide. On the luxury cruise ship Atlantis, which plied the waters of the Caribbean, there were ominous rumors about cabin number 666. Passengers and crew knew about this room, but no one wanted to even approach the cabin door unnecessarily. Although the room looked like an ordinary cabin from the outside, there were events going on inside that could not be explained logically. Cabin 666 was located on the middle deck, among other ordinary cabins. However, it was the only one that was often empty, despite the high demand for seat. Those who ventured into this room were met with strange occurrences. Knocks at night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and a cold, unpleasant draft that suddenly burst into the room, even with the windows and doors closed. The cabin's first known victim was Robert Mason, a New York businessman who had decided to take a vacation after a hard year. He was a man who did not believe in the supernatural and treated the rumors with irony. However, the very first night when he went to bed, Mason felt the temperature in the room plummet. The air conditioner was off, but the cold was literally chilling to the bone. Later, he heard a light knock, as if someone had knocked gently on the door. Breathless, Robert got up and opened the door, but there was no one in the hallway. Shrugging, he went back to bed, figuring it was just a play of his imagination. An hour later, he was awakened by the sound of whispering. It sounded like someone was talking right next to his ear. Robert jumped up abruptly and turned on the light, but the room was empty. Over the next few nights, events only got worse. Robert could hear heavy footsteps behind the wall, although according to the deck diagram there should have been no space behind his quarters. Sometimes he thought someone was quietly scrabbling in the walls, giving him goosebumps. He even called a crewman to check the cabin for any technical problems, but the man just shrugged and said everything was normal. On the fourth night, Robert awoke to the sensation of someone sitting on his bed. His heart was racing as he slowly turned around and saw a dark silhouette. The next second the light flickered and the figure disappeared, leaving only the faint odor of burning. The next day Robert insisted on moving to a different cabin, but the anxiety didn't let him go for the rest of the cruise. After his return home, he learned that several other passengers had lived in cabin 666 before him, all of whom had experienced unexplained phenomena. Some had heard footsteps, some had noticed strange shadows, and one woman claimed to have seen the handprints of strangers on the mirror in the morning. The airliner's crew eventually began to avoid mentioning the room. Internal records showed that more than 15 passengers complained of fear and anxiety after spending the night there. Some even abandoned the cruise early to leave the ill-fated ship. The story of Cabin 666 became a legend among sailors and travelers. It was believed that the cabin was cursed, and its walls remembered an old tragedy / U-2013 fire that happened many years ago on the maiden voyage of Atlantis, when several passengers died in the fire. It happened on one of the most popular cruise liners, which was on a voyage on the Atlantic Ocean. The ship was called Vega, and it was its last voyage of the season. The program was full, luxurious cabins, a variety of restaurants and entertainment, endless horizons and quiet nights in the ocean. However, despite all the comforts and beauty, passengers on this cruise will never forget the events that took place during this voyage. The passengers aboard the Vega were happy, especially those who were on the cruise for the first time. The ship was new and the atmosphere on board was incredibly cheerful. There were tourists merrily strolling around on the decks enjoying the views. There were parties going on in the bars, and the restaurant was serving food that you don't often get to try on land. However, there was something unusual on this cruise that was not immediately apparent. As soon as the liner left port and sailed into the open sea, an old sailor named Richard, who worked as one of the crew, warned the passengers to stay away from a certain part of the deck during the hours of darkness. He didn't give details, only that this part of the liner had a bad reputation. No one paid much attention to it, for old men always liked to tell scary stories. But soon Richard himself became a living source for the other passengers, who told one of the creepiest stories that had happened to him on the seas. Richard was an experienced sailor who had spent more than 30 years on the water. He had seen many strange things, but, he said, what he had experienced once in the Atlantic Ocean surpassed them all. He said that a few years ago, he was on another cruise ship when, during an overnight voyage, their vessel collided with a mysterious craft. It was on the high seas, far from any land or shores. It was a ghost ship, Richard claimed, shaking his head. He recounted that on that ship, they first noticed flickering lights in the night that gradually grew brighter and brighter. At first they thought it was another ship, but the lights didn't move, and as their liner got closer, they all realized that the ship in front of them was a ship covered in rust and dirt, and its silhouette was unusually blurred. It was as if it wasn't quite real, as if it didn't exist at all, but was merely a reflection in time, hidden in the fog. Richard and his colleagues tried to call the captain, but the radio contact didn't work. When they decided to approach the strange ship, its lights flickered and it disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only empty space in the night ocean. During the Vega cruise, Many passengers began to report strange occurrences at night. Some noted that they heard footsteps when no one was around, while others complained of strange sounds like someone whispering something in the dark. One of the passengers, a young guy named James, said that while walking on the upper deck at night, he saw a strange silhouette on the horizon. At first he thought it was another ship, but he couldn't tell for sure because the ship was moving too strangely, as if not in a direction, but as if hanging in the air. James moved closer and saw its lights flicker on and off. After a few seconds it all disappeared, and he was left alone on the deck with a feeling of complete silence. This incident was no exception. Other passengers also recounted their experiences. Sometimes, looking out to sea at night, they saw vague lights that immediately disappeared. Some of them even claimed to have seen silhouettes aboard that ship. However, all these events were so strange that most people chose not to tell their friends, let alone the captain. People started talking about the ghost ship, but everything was taken as a bad joke or unreliable rumors. One night, when the liner Vega was in the very center of the Atlantic, an incredible incident occurred. Passengers who were walking on the upper deck noticed a strange silhouette appearing on the horizon. It was familiar, as if it was the same ship they had seen earlier. The lights flickered, and its misty figure moved slowly toward the liner. This time, however, no one left it unnoticed. Two passengers, Anne and Michael, who were sitting on the balcony of their cabin, spotted the ship and started recording everything that was happening on their camera. The camera did not transmit any clear images, only a dark silhouette. When the ship was very close, suddenly, after a few seconds, it disappeared. In that moment it was clear. This was no ordinary ship, but something supernatural. Later, the next morning, when the crew began checking all passengers and crew, it was discovered that one of the crew was missing. It was the senior assistant captain. His name was Richard Scott, and he had not returned to his cabin after his night shift. Everyone began to worry, but hours later, when their liner reached the nearest port, Scott was still missing. This was no longer a random disappearance, but something truly disturbing. According to rumors, even the captain of the Vega could no longer remain calm. He said that before departure he had noticed a ghost ship on the horizon, which had met their ship several times before. Once at the steering wheel, the captain stated that long ago, back in the last century, this ship had been a wreck and its crew had died under tragic circumstances. Now its ghost wanders the ocean, haunting those who come within its range. As the incidents of missing crew members continued, the captain decided to cut the cruise short and return to port earlier than planned. The liner Vega returned to port, but passengers and crew discussed those strange events for a long time. But the biggest mystery remained the disappeared ghost ship, which still appears on the horizon, bringing with it only fog and disappearing lights. To this day, when someone takes a cruise on the Atlantic Ocean, old sailors warn of encounters with ghost ships, and not everyone is ready to believe the stories. But those who were aboard the Vega still can't forget the night they witnessed something that defies explanation.